we're starting to see more and more efforts by the Russians to evade or overwhelm defenders who are relying heavily on drones. And so they're both showing a pretty appalling disregard for their own forces' lives by throwing people on crutches or in wheelchairs. The walking wounded are being thrown back into the fight, and they are of limited direct military value, but they get killed, and that takes up another drone, or it takes up more fire, or exhausts the defenders. Meanwhile, they're experimenting with buggies and motorbikes and very, very mobile forms to try and evade Ukrainian drones, and that's not being wholly successful. And they haven't made huge breakthroughs there, but they have threatened in a few places because they're able to move around very rapidly.
There had been that moment of stagnation only a few months ago in Russia's assault, especially in the Donbass earlier this year. Has Russia managed to regain any of that momentum or open a front that would be a big worry to Ukraine?
Not at the moment, and I think if I was feeling a bit concerned a few months ago, and you could see from the way that casualties were mounting, Ukrainians might be concerned. They might be a bit more optimistic is not the right word, but confident in their ability to hold close to current lines. The Russians are still advancing. Ukraine has, largely speaking, lost the incursion in Kursk. The points of pressure are still around the Donbass and a few other places. There haven't been any huge Russian breakthroughs, and I think the Ukrainians have stabilized their positions. There are, of course, still points of concern. First is that the Russian reduction in tempo is potentially because they are beginning to store up forces. They're literally, trying to bring in more armored vehicles and bring in more people to prepare to have a more significant push in the summer. Every sign is that the Russians are still meeting all of their recruiting targets. And this is voluntary recruitment. They're not being forced to mobilize people. They are getting volunteers in because they are increasing the bounties that they offer, effectively the payment. That means it's very expensive, but if they're prepared to pay that financial cost, they are replacing their losses. So the Ukrainians are not able to whittle them down. And in return, Ukrainian casualties are, they are also lower, but they are at the moment slightly harder to replace. They just have less of a pool to go into. The killing zone around the front line still makes it a very unhealthy environment for armored vehicles, although you still need them to get to close to the front. They're still highly valued. There is still this battle of the drones going on in electronic warfare, with artillery still playing a role, and the Russians have got, more artillery, although the Ukrainians managed to close the gap in terms of shells. I think we're starting to see more and more efforts by the Russians to evade or overwhelm defenders who are relying heavily on drones. And so they're both showing a pretty appalling disregard for their own forces' lives by throwing people on crutches or in wheelchairs. The walking wounded are being thrown back into the fight, and they are of limited direct military value, but they get killed, and that takes up another drone, or it takes up more fire, or exhausts the defenders. Meanwhile, they're experimenting with buggies and motorbikes and very, very mobile forms to try and evade Ukrainian drones, and that's not being wholly successful. And they haven't made huge breakthroughs there, but they have threatened in a few places because they're able to move around very rapidly. They're playing around with what they can do to more rapidly bring pressure to bear on the Ukrainian lines. And so I think we will continue to see this toying with tactics. Meanwhile, the electronic warfare fight to blind surveillance or jam it, or to detect where the other side is storing its drones, or where the drone operators are, or where artillery is positioned, to make it more difficult to bring that firepower to bear. This constant battle is going on. So I think what's happening is that The front line looks like it has certainly slowed its movements, but the tactic evolution and coming up with counter tactics is absolutely still happening.
And we've been hearing about the Russian push possibly into Dnipro Petrovsk. This region isn't even part of the sort of claimed annexation by Russia and the Kremlin of Ukraine. Is there anything Russia would really want with that territory, or is it just a matter of it's the only place they can advance?
Well, some of this is where they push on and they find advantage. Some of it is they have more people on the on the front, if you like. I mean, they have probably now, because they've managed to increase the numbers, maybe 620,000 or more people along the front line, that sort of 1,000-kilometer stretch. And the Ukrainians have mobilized maybe 800,000, but they don't have as many on the front. And that means the Russians have got a slight advantage in that they can push in multiple places. So they've been able to, with North Korean help, almost fully eject the Ukrainians from Kursk, and they're threatening Sumy. They've also been threatening towards Kharkiv. And then you sweep down to the south, and suddenly Kherson and Zaporizhia are both places where they've been pressing. And so they're pressing all the way along the front. And that is what exhausts the Ukrainians. They can't pull forces off that front line, and this hasn't radically changed. They've also got to maintain some kind of defensive position everywhere. And what we've seen with modern surveillance and with drones and with different ways you operate, the Ukrainians might be defending very large frontages with very small numbers of people who are very spread out. And they're able to defend those positions, particularly if they strengthen physical defenses. But it means that they're not densely packed, so they're less of a target. But if the Russians can get through and threaten somewhere with large numbers of people, it is commensurately harder for the Ukrainians to hold on to it. Because you might be talking of square kilometers of ground being held by a couple of dozen people. And so I think that the significance is in as much their ability to keep pressing everywhere. I think the Russians have not taken fully any of the places that were their key targets. Although if you look at, say, Touretsk or Chasiv Yar, those are essentially gone, but the Ukrainians are fighting on. So the success is the Ukrainians have denied them fully taking those positions. But the Russians are there in numbers, and there's some of those places like Chasiv Yar give them higher ground to threaten elsewhere. The Russians have not taken Pokrovsk. Uh, they've not even fully encircled it, but they are edging their way round. And this all matters in terms of the battlefield, partly because places like Kramatorsk and Sloviansk become more at risk, but also because it means that if there is a breakthrough, eventually, if there's no change in the balance of forces, the Russians will be able to make numbers work in their favor somewhere. And that's the challenge of the disadvantage that the Ukrainians face. So they need to find a way to essentially, kill more Russians, kill and injure more Russians to negate that numbers advantage.
And where should we be keeping an eye on then, or watching carefully for the rest of the year in terms of what Russia might target? I'm not just thinking, of course, of eastern Ukraine, but places like the border with Kursk as well.
So I definitely think there is an issue around the border, partly because they want to eject the very, very last of those Ukrainian forces. The past, I think, week has seen some interesting developments in that, having largely speaking left Kursk, the Ukrainians have been able to still raid back into Kursk. And that's true even in the past few days. And they've been threatening into Belgorod. So they haven't. The Russians have not been able to completely remove everybody who was up there and just shift them elsewhere. There is still some distraction taking place. Conversely, though, they are threatening into Sumy. And that means the reverse is true, that the Ukrainians have got to keep some forces there to protect Sumy, to protect the north. I think a retrospective analysis of the Kursk element of the campaign might conclude that the forces that chewed up, that the Ukrainians committed, were more valuable to them than the forces that the Russians ended up committing, or indeed the North Koreans, because that was mostly the Ukrainian reserve or reserve capacity that was used up there. And as we can see at the moment, it wasn't able to be traded into negotiations. So I think what we should be looking out for is, where do the Russians continue to be able to exert pressure where the Ukrainian ability to respond with pressure is limited? I mean, I think that, the Donbass remains the main thrust, because what they really want to do is take the remaining territory of those, the four oblasts, which is Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk. That territory, which they've on paper annexed, will continue to be where they want to enact some kind of uh, de facto control, leading to ideally de jure control.
And is that militarily, is that a realistic aim for this year?
At the rate at which they've been progressing, no. I mean, I think some people have done. It depends on when you draw the line, but some people have done the calculations that it's sort of like another 10 years at rates of advance. I think the others, of course. I mean, that's mostly for Kherson and Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk. If they tweak how they're operating and successfully kind of push through on some of those more vulnerable bits, maybe. And this, of course, is at the root of continuing to play for time whilst they eke out ground. And I think it is to the Ukrainians' credit that they managed to forestall those advances to such an extent that the Russians haven't made that progress that they might have thought they were going to make in, say, November.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can sign up for a membership at the link below, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to the latest news and analysis on Times Radio, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.